If you're a TFT player that loves playing perfect setup comps where if you get the conditions right, you'll win every single round for the rest of the game, well, I got the thing for you. Not too long ago, Riot released a bunch of new artifact items where if you use them correctly, can just set up crazy combos that just can't be beat. So here are my 5 secret tech artifact combos that every player should know when playing ranked. It's time to show them that your comp has no pathetic cards. The first composition I want to talk about is Artifact Gnar. I think Gnar is really versatile with a lot of different artifacts in particular, but the best ones currently are Corrupt Vampiric Scepter and Silvermere Dawn. You can play things like Mittens, Death Defiance, Infinity Force, but they do have a noticeable performance gap, 10% off your win rate when you start playing some of these other tier 2 items versus the tier 1 stuff. But as you might notice, the builds are different. Depending on what you get, you have a different build for it, so let's go ahead and dive into it. If you end up playing Corrupt Vampiric Scepter, you want more attack speed because you cannot cast your ability or gain mana, so you just become an auto attacker. And this works really well with Gnar because he scales the amount of AD that he gets off his ability. And so you just give him a ton of AD and attack speed, and he just goes to town on a bunch of people. And for that reason, Quicksilver is important so you can ramp up that attack speed and not feel like Gnar gets interrupted by CC. If you do end up going for Silvermere Dawn, you end up wanting to play around healing and either a Stairs Gauge or a second form of healing like Hand of Justice. This is because Silvermere Dawn turns him into, instead of attacking a lot, into a big time caster and scaling off of him that way. So it's actually really cool because there's 2 versions of Gnar. There's one that auto attacks and goes crazy, and then there's the other where he turns into the Beast Titan and just slings a bunch of rocks and kills people. The other win conditions to think about are to play for 3-star Kindred with good items, blue buff Nashers, Morello, other AP, Shiv, things like that. And then you also really want to stack your other Dryads if you can. Azir is very, very good top end to help you win the game, as well as getting things like 6 Dryad. The emblem is flexible. You can put the emblem onto like Alawi or Shen. If you're playing into more ghostly, you can put it on Kayn. There's a lot of good augments, but some very notable ones are Dryad +1 for obvious reasons. Baboom, which is really good if you're not playing the Corrupted Vampiric Scepter because you can't cast your ability, is mainly for Kindred at that point. Heavy Hitters, which scales off the amount of HP you have. Too Healthy because you're playing something at 2 cost, and then Tiny but Deadly, which helps the Gnar get into the backline and mess with a bunch of those backline carries. The ideal opener you can play with this is Dryad Fated. Pretty straightforward for most setups. You play the Gnar and Kindred for the Dryad and a bunch of Fated units, and then maybe tie in the Alawi for the Warden. Here's some extra tips to consider and think about. You want to make sure you're rolling on 6 and not 7. In the past, you used to be able to roll on 7 a lot more often because you could pick up some other 4 costs like Kayn and Ornn alongside your other 2 costs. But now they nerfed those odds in favor for 3 costs at 7. And because we're not rolling for that many 3 costs, just look, 1, 2, 3, 4 2-cost units that you could potentially 3-star. We're just going to be rolling on 6. Gnar should be in the corners to act as backline. This means A1, A7, the top left and the top right. And that's because we want Gnar to be able to kill that unit quickly and get to the backline corner unit like an Ashe or a Lilia and assassinate them as soon as possible. For that very reason, we also put Kindred behind that Gnar so you can blast past that unit. And if you do end up playing things like Last Whisper, you end up putting that on Kindred. I'm going out of order, but might as well talk about it now. Even Shroud is good to also play, so it helps Gnar get through units because you don't have any Sunder otherwise. Redemption is good for the AoE healing and the damage reduction for Gnar. Just something to think about. If you do play Redemption, put it next to the Gnar. Dryads do snowball. More kills equals likely to kill more. That just means you want to play strongest board very often, as much as you can, because every kill that you can get might lead to you being stronger for the next fight, which leads to more kills and so on and so forth, and snowballing that Dryad. Frontline is important, but it is flexible who you can itemize. We have items on Ornn in this example from TFT Academy. But if you do hit Alawi 3 and Shen 3, you can also itemize them as well. If you do have a Dryad emblem, Alawi 3 is probably better than Ornn 2, but that's very situational. And good luck ever hitting Alawi 3 in a lot of lobbies right now. You can also play Ghostly Vertical if you do get that emblem. You can go for 6 Ghostly instead, play around Kayn and Morgana, and put a little bit of the Dryad on the backseat. Just play like 4 Dryad and not try to go for 6. And because this has infinite scaling, it caps really, really high. Don't be surprised to see Gnar win a lot of lobbies when you get this setup going. In my opinion, the most consistent out of all these compositions that we'll be showing today. Secret tech number 2 is Blighting Jewel on Teemo reroll, but specifically with Teemo and Lux. This is because with the new item Blighting Jewel, when you deal magic damage, it reduces that magic resistance by 3, and if it hits 0, you just get 5 mana instead. And that actually ends up being really good with things that deal damage over time, like a poison tick, which is exactly what Teemo's Mushroom does. And Blighting Jewel ends up having really, really good synergy with Teemo in particular. From the limited sample size, you can see that it actually does very, very well, but there is one extra condition on top of Blighting Jewel. The second main condition that you want is having a good Exalted for Teemo setup. And there's several variations that you could play. The best one is the one that just plays Lux and Teemo together, and then you just throw in like a frontliner like Galio or maybe Morgana. There's also really good Exalteds on Sivir, Shen, and Warden, so pay attention to those. For example, this one you can play Sivir, Shen, and Sylas/Janna. In this one you can play Teemo and Nautilus. This one is Sivir and a Mumu, or you can have Sivir, Lux, and another frontliner, either like Tahm Kench or a backline like Morgana. So as long as you have these 2 out of 3 units on Exalted that are good, but you throw in just like another unit that's fine, like Shen or like a random Warden or Sylas, then that's a good Exalted for this composition. The 2 most important items for Teemo is Blighting Jewel and Blue Buff. Having Blue Buff versus like Shojin or Adaptive is completely different world. Blue Buff is so much better for Teemo, especially because you're aiming to snipe backline as soon as possible. Third item is pretty arguable for whatever you want based on your itemization. So Gnasher's Tooth is good, so it combos and spam cast as fast as it can. Gunblade is good to heal your frontline. Deathcat for more burst. Morello for burn. There's other items I'm not including as well that you can also justify depending on your spot. But try to see if you can go every way to get blue buff. So play with this if you get Teemos and you get Tears and the Blighting Jewel. Secondary win condition is also just having 3-star Lux and a good frontline. You do want Lux with good items as well because you want to tag team the backline, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Good augments to play for this composition. Lucky Ricochet, so you get an extra bounce, which is always effective. Caretaker's Ally is really nice because you can get Lux or Teemo or even some other 2 cost that might fit your Exalted really nicely. Too Healthy because you're playing a lot of 2 cost. Living Forge, which is really nice because you can get more opportunities at Blighting Jewel plus other things for your front line. Spirit Guardians because you're playing a Warden frontline that naturally connects to Lux. The ideal opener you're looking for is Story Reavers with Teemo and upgraded frontline. This is like the best case scenario, but a lot of times you're just going to play, cheaper units than Zoe and Alawi. Some additional tips for you to consider. First is that MR Shred is still kind of important for the first portion of the fight. It's probably not half the fight. It's probably like the first 10 seconds. It can still be pretty clutch. So in late game situations, you can still play like Shiv on Lux or anyone else that can hold Spark. I think that's totally fine. But you do have a ton of MR Shred anyways with the Blighting Jewel. So it's just one of those things where the faster you shred, the faster you can get them to 0 and the faster you can ultimately snipe everything as well. True Biz Teemo is actually Blighting Jewel plus the blue buff and Tattoo of Toxin. It's an Ink Shadow item. How you get that is pretty, up to you. You could play Kaisa for the Ink Shadow and then maybe Jax instead of Garen, and then you tech in the third Ink Shadow. If you can get that in, Tattoo of Toxin ends up working doubly with Teemo's effect, and you get the Blighting Jewel all snowballing, and it can actually just straight up be the true Exodia you're looking for. Remember that the win condition is sniping the enemy back line, so ultimately you want to position for that. That sometimes means that you split up Teemo and Lux in the late game. The way it works is that Lux will target the farthest unit, and then Teemo will target the nearest non-poison enemy. So in this example, if you move Lux and Zoe and you swap them, Teemo will tag the top right carry as soon as he can, and then Lux will aim to the top right. So if you're going up against like Ashe and Lilia and they're not paying attention, that's the fast way you can snipe them. And then the inverse of that, if you're going up against them, is really important. So place your Lilias and your Ashes and your Syndras, etc. in the back center. So that way Lux isn't targeting them first, so you can set up some corner units. You can drop Story Weaver late game. We showed one example of Kaisa Garen, but another could be like Set and Xayah, just like a bunch of other different ways you can play it. Or if you're playing a Vertical Bruiser setup, which is another way you can play it, kind of similar to the Kabuko no Hero Sivir Teemo. If you do end up playing Wardens, just keep in mind that Nas positioning can make or break the entire fight. In late game spots, if people are greeting too hard with their aura items or their buffs, you can use Nas to win the fight entirely because Teemo and Lux will try to end things quickly. So the first 10 seconds of the fight are oftentimes where the fight gets determined. Hence why I think even including that shred can be really, really important. But now that I mentioned it, I didn't write it down, but you can play that Bruiser variant with Teemo. The Kabuko no Hero Teemo Sivir comp that I did a video on is another comp that you can actually play this Blighting Jewel Teemo on. It's just that this Warden variant with Lux has a lot of easy access to Exalted, and if you're going to be playing Lux Teemo, you want to play a Mumu and try to build into that Warden. But you do have options of how you build it out. Number 3 is Wits End Bard. This one's actually pretty well documented, and you can see that in just the number of games being played. Just thousands of people have played these games with Wits End Bard in particular. But I do want to highlight that Tahm Kench is also really good with other artifacts as well, like Forbidden Idol and Innervating Locket. That's something that is a little bit more underground. Specifically, Wits End is really good with Bard because the attacks with all the little meeps that are being thrown around end up dealing a lot of bonus damage. And the secondary effect of Wits End, which is really good, is It heals the holder, so ends up sustaining Bard against a lot of the AoE, against like Lilia, for example, or anyone that jumps on him with the back line. You usually want to play this if you start off with an early Bard and you get a lot of econ as well as components for against his Rage Blade, so like a bow or a rod. And that's because your tempo curve matters a lot, because you're going to have this big gap between when you have Bard 2 and Tahm Kench 2 and Bard 3 and Tahm Kench 3. That's probably going to take like a whole stage and a half for you to get online. And so the more HP you have to preserve, the less punishing it is for you to be stuck on Bard 2 and Tahm Kench 2 while you're rerolling for all those units. Make sure you get strong Tahm Kench items. A really good setup that's generically powerful is Stone Plate, Dragon's Claw, and Redemption, but you do need a lot of cloaks for it. If you do get Forbidden Idol, you could probably replace either Redemption or Dragon's Claw, and Innervating Locket, same exact thing. If you do end up getting even more extra AP items, just slap them onto Soraka and Zoe. Remember that they can actually also provide good secondary damage as well if you're not just relying solo on Bard and Tahm Kench. Really good augments for this composition. Lucky Ricochet for more bounces similar to Teemo. Living Forge, because clearly you can use multiple artifact items. Prismatic Ticket, because this comp is insanely expensive, so getting more free rerolls is always really nice. Dragon Spear is really underrated for this comp, because if you can get on a Tahm Kench early, you're able to farm more components, and hey, those components might turn into, you know, extra Bard items, or maybe even itemize your secondary carries. And because you really want specific items, Pandora's helps you get them, like the double Rage Blade on top of the Wits End. Or maybe you can do something really cute, like you get offered a artifact item that you don't want. You can just keep rolling with Pandora's every single turn until you get an artifact that you want. And the ideal opener is Mythic plus Story Weavers. Pretty straightforward. Just have the Bard and the Tahm Kench plus one Mythic. Ideally more frontline like Nico. You can also play Cho'Gath and then tie in some Story Weavers alongside them. Some things to consider with Bard. Put Bard behind Tahm Kench almost always. Don't have Bard like here on the far right and then Bard on the bottom left. And try to be away from enemy carries because you need to ramp up. You just need time, and you can stall for long enough. Bard will kill everything in the game because of how much attack speed he gets. He's trying to scale, so be far away. Some instances you might want Bard to be on the same side as enemy carries, but that's very, very rare. So for now, just always away. Late game, don't greed your auras. This is mainly for the fact that you're playing on Sivir and Kayle. I see people full greed. They put like Soraka here and they put Sivir like right next to Bard, so they get full amount of attack speed greed, but that ends up being really punishing against a lot of AoE. I'd rather them focus their AoE with Hui and Morgana and Nautilus over here, while Bard doesn't get interrupted and he can scale. If you do get a spot where you play for a Radiant Ginsu's Rage Blade, you don't need to actually play two Rage Blades anymore. Instead, the third item could be something else. Another common item people like to play is Gun Blades. You can heal the Tahm Kench, but you have a lot of options here. You know, like Giant Slayer is fine too. Shred and Sunder are both good because Bard actually splits 50-50 in terms of magic and physical damage. So having Shred and Sunder both can be really, really good. I prefer to have Shiv and Last Whisper because Bard meep shots will bounce to the backline and kill. So for that same reason, you kind of want to have that Shiv. But, you know, whatever you can get is good. There's an argument that you can even play around Talisman of Aid Kayle, which is the green Kayle to get that shred. So that way you're not as dependent for those items. Or picking up something like Obsidian Cleaver in the late game. Always roll on 7, don't go on 8. I've seen so many people who are like close, and if you are rolling on 8, you just minimize your chance of hitting things like Tahm Kench and Bard 3. The odds are so good. Please don't go to 8 too early and then start rolling for Bard. Very, very rare scenarios you're supposed to do that. And then the last thing is you can play 7 Mythic with a Mythic Emblem. You don't have to play this altruist version of Bard with like Riven and Rakan and Soraka. Instead, you can play for Vertical Mythic, play for Lily and Hui, but it's very high roll and you do need that +1. The fourth comp is Revive Kayle around the new item Suspicious Trenchcoat, and you go for a Tome of Mending. On the stats, not that many gains, but look at how effective it is in terms of a high average placement and a really good win rate. The reason why you want to get to 9 is because you want to look for the 5 costs like Lysandra and Irelia, and obviously this Rakan. Lysandra is the best holder of the Suspicious Trenchcoat with the Vows, and it actually counts towards the revive, so you end up getting Lysandra back with that Trenchcoat to split again, and then you just get a bunch of Lysandras on the board, which can pot everything, farm a bunch of gold. It's really fun, and it's also just pretty epic to like see so many of the same units continue to split. The main condition for this is that you want Trenchcoat and the ability to get to 7 Story Weaver, which usually means you want a Story Weaver emblem. And that's because unless you had the Story Weaver emblem, you're not going to get the ability to go for Tome of Mending unless you hit Irelia. That's very, very hard. The Protector's Vows are just to help you get the Lysandra casts off. What ends up happening is Lysandra splits, like she's playing little Cell Juniors, and then they end up dying before they're able to do anything because they actually can't cast. They don't have enough mana. So the Protector Vows are really important. But if you don't get Lysandra, you can also play Ornn temporarily, so you can get like a bunch of items on all your units. You can put on Silas just to have a bunch of DPS units, and Silas can end up being very effective. Try to see if you can get Umberland if you do end up playing Silas. You know, Udyr is also decent as well. This is all temporary, though, because in the end, you still want your North Star to be Lysandra. Get Irelia with 3 items as well. Things like Deathblade, IE, Guardbreaker, Runin, so on and so forth. Good augments, Storyweaver, emblems of any kind, Call to Adventure to scale the Kayle, Gifts to the Fallen to help scale your very key units. Dynamic Duo is pretty good because it just gives you a lot of the 5 costs that could be good. So Lysandra or Irelia, or even hit like Rakan, Udyr, right? So you can all use this. Pretty much you just don't want like 2 of them, like Set and Azir. Tiny Tens end up doing well in the stats, and it's actually interesting because not only does it let you stall out to get to 9, but also this is a spot that you can play off of Fortune. If you play off of Fortune, you open an Anvil and you see like a Suspicious Trenchcoat and you're playing like a Storyweaver setup, maybe you can play instead of Storyweaver and just play for that out as well. Storyweaver is the best opener. Not really much explanation needed beyond that. Some extra tips. Always solo frontline your Trenchcoat holder. I see a lot of people sometimes even position like this and Lysandra doesn't die in time because they're playing like Garen in the second row. It's like a 1-star Garen. He dies. So it ends up delaying the revive from Kayle because it's every several seconds that it revives a unit. So make sure Lysandra is the first to die. And remember that reviving is reviving the strongest unit that hasn't been revived yet. And the strongest unit by definition in TFT is whoever's holding the most items. And if you have 2 units who are tied number of items, it's the star level. So you might have a situation where you have like 3-item Galio and 3-item Lysandra. If they both die and Galio's 2-star and Lysandra's 1-star, then Galio comes back. So just keep that in mind. In other words, try to avoid 3 items on anyone else, but you do want 3 items on Irelia, so it's okay. Irelia's not going to die that quickly, so that's fine. And I guess that applies to Zoe, just not any units that are within the blast zone of this Lysandra. Here's a couple of bonus artifact tips that are really good. Irelia really likes Trickster's Glass and also the Vampiric Scepter. Let's say you take the Vampiric Scepter, but the Gnar reroll isn't working out. Just put it in Irelia and just watch her go to town. Sivir gets replaced with Emblem. She's the weak unit, and she's also the Irelia item holder. You still need to play an upgraded board. I see a lot of people say, hey, I'm going to rush this board, but they're playing 1-star Garen, 1-star Zyra, 1-star Riven, 1-star Zoe, 1-star Irelia, and being like, wow, I'm not winning anything. It's like, well, that's because you don't actually have damage on your board besides the crazy combo. So make sure you upgrade your Storyweaver board and make that Kayle strong, make the rest of your board strong. If you end up chasing Zoe 3-star, roll for her at 9 and not 7 because, again, you need to get to 9 for those extra 5 costs. And then the duelist for Irelia is relevant. If you do end up playing around duelists, play a Lee Sin. Lee Sin's a Dragon Lord that ties with their con as well. So you do have some flexibility for that as your item holder if you need. Last but not least, the dark tech that pretty much no one's talking about right now. Silvermere Riven. This is playing around Silvermere Dawn, which we talked about with Gnar earlier. And instead of playing around Gnar, you play around Riven because Riven doesn't care about auto-attacking as much. She just cares about casting. And so because a lot of damage is done in her ability, she can actually take that damage to get mana and drain tank and heal it back up with double healing. So that is usually the condition that you end up playing for, like Silvermere Dawn plus like a healing item. You could also play Sterak's Gauge instead of a second healing item, but I want to make it up for it with good combat augments if that's the case. And also try to make sure that you're uncontested Riven. This is something that's also very subtle about the composition, but if you see the people playing trick shots, they want Bruiser frontline. If they play Kabuko hero augment, they want Bruisers. If they play Ghostly AP, they're probably going to take Riven as well. If you have 3 players or more that's just going to naturally pick up Rivens, that just means that it's very unlikely you're going to hit Riven 3 quickly, and it's going to be a tough game. If there's 2 players, that's probably passable given the number of units in the bag, but that is something to think about. The secondary win conditions is you do want a backliner of some kind. So in this case, Zyra is a really good example because it ties in really nicely with Sage and Morgana. But you can also play a bunch of their backliners like Irelia as a Storyweaver unit, Zoe as an Arcanist unit, and 3-star her. If you can get to 4 Altruists, it's really good for Riven as well. The resistances is really nice. Plus, Riven starts to heal not just herself, but another really valuable unit. So it can be a really powerful feedback loop. And a bunch of 5 costs synergize a lot with this. Good augments for Riven. If you're playing Vertical Bruisers, Well Fed is really powerful. Same thing with Heavy Hitters, just scales off your HP. Martyr is really good with melee carries in general. Just has that burst healing to keep Riven alive so you can get another cast in. Altruist Emblem so you can get the 4 Altruist. Jeweled Lotus because you're trying to cast so often and you're having an 80 burst caster deal a bunch of damage. And the ideal opener is just playing around like Storyweaver plus Bruisers and just utilizing this Riven as an item holder. And some bonus tips for this comp. Reroll on 6, so you can go for a Riven 3 on 2 cost odds. The core is very flexible. Riven, Galio, Soraka, and Rakan are all you need. You could actually play anything else with the other half of the units. So if you play Vertical Bruisers, you can have Silas as a secondary carry. You can play like a Heavenly support. You put like Nico with extra Dragon Lords and Sages, like a bunch of different traits in. You can also just throw in Riven 3 in a bunch of other reroll comms that include Riven. We mentioned Bard, for example. If you just get Silvermere Dawn because you're playing Living Forge and you roll for Bard 3, Tom Kench 3, and now Riven becomes your secondary carry, you can put Silvermere Dawn on Riven and watch her go crazy. But you could also play her in like the Ghostly AP reroll and anything else that makes sense, right? Like Kabuko, Lucky Paws, so on and so forth. Galio's always near Riven for the taunt effect, and that is somewhat key because Riven will take damage early in the fight. Let's say there's an Ashe in the top right, and then Galio will taunt, so Riven can dip low, heal back up, and then Galio's taunt finishes, and then Riven is able to kind of get back into the fray and not worry about getting bursted down. And that's really key, especially if your opponent has anti-heal, to cut into Riven's effectiveness for the healing. If you play Zyra, anti-heal is a lower priority for yourself, meaning that you don't have to go out of your way to build Red Buff and Morello and Sunfire as quickly. It's still nice to have in the late game because ultimately sometimes you want to burn more than just 1 or 2 targets. But Zyra does wound as part of her ability kit, so you don't necessarily need to rush for it as fast as you usually do. You can play Talisman 8 for Sundering, because remember, Riven's an AD champion, and plus you're playing like a hybrid comp in a lot of situations if you're rerolling for Zyra, so it's like 80 AP mix. Just play the Talisman so you can get Sundering on top of Shredding. Last but not least, this is a nice detail to add. Riven is a melee carry, and how many times have you seen this set? Support items are really good for those melee carries like Yone, like Lee Sin, like Kayn. Same story. Locket, very good for Riven. Find Vintage, if you can support Riven with those items, is a god combo. So get it all rolling and soup up that Riven so she can 1v9 anything. So there you have it, my 5 secret or maybe not so secret tech on some of these comps for you guys to climb infinite LP. Do you have some secret tech with artifacts that people haven't discovered yet? Let me know in the comments below and maybe I'll do a video on it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.